Comic book fans, pulp fans, shadow fans, you'd better grab something. Hold on and hold on tight, because I guarantee you, you've never seen anything like this. Here we go.
Extra, extra! Read all about it. Crime runs wild in streets. Economy plunges into chaos. Extra, extra! Read all about it.
The Shadow's story begins back in the days of the mob, as the light-hearted prohibition-fueled roaring 20s gave way to the darkness of the Great Depression. Crime was running wild in the streets. The economy was plunging into chaos, and there seemed to be no escape, except in the pulps. Tech story magazines with sleek poster-styled covers displaying fantastic scenes of adventure, sex, and violence. Full of radiant women and bright young men who had turned to the dark side. Murder. Doom. Death. Screeching skulls and giant germs. Thrilling love. True detectives. The term pulp comes from the cheap paper these stories were printed on, called wood pulp, but it also recalls the phrase beaten to a pulp, making it an appropriate nickname for dime novels depicting thrilling adventures, titillating love stories, and hard-boiled crime fiction. One pulp publisher, Street and Smith, located in Manhattan, hit upon a unique cross-promotional gimmick. They would increase sales of their detective story magazine by sponsoring a weekly radio program dramatizing its stories. Scriptwriter Harry Charlot suggested the host of Detective Story Magazine Hour be a sinister-sounding hooded character whom Charlot named the Shadow. As original Shadow radio announcer Ken Roberts recalls,
when I came onto the show, The Shadow was a series of dramatic crime programs solved by different detectives every week. The role of the Shadow on that program was to introduce it and to act as something of a narrator.
Broadway actor James LaCurto was chosen to play the Shadow, and when Detective Story Magazine Hour premiered on July 31, 1930, listeners heard LaCurto speak a familiar phrase for the first time.
The Shadow knows.
LaCurto voiced the Shadow for just a handful of episodes. Then he returned to Broadway. He was replaced by an actor named Frank Reddick.
Today the usurers are the gods of the earth, and the only mortal sin is to be poor.
Indeed. And as Frank Reddick's sinister voice went crackling across the airwaves, audiences across America were transported into the Shadow's fiendishly inviting world of brutal crime and swift justice.
Does crime the Shadow? Money, thousands of dollars in vaults, a woman greedy for love, for gold. Watch carefully while this story comes to life.
And once he had done his opening line, he was practically finished on the program until the very end of the show when he came back with
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
The program had been created to promote Detective Story Magazine, but after listeners heard Frank Reddick's mesmerizing performance as the Shadow, They rushed to newsstands to buy The Shadow magazine. Unfortunately, no such magazine existed. But it was potentially much worse than that, Shadow fans. What if one of Street and Smith's competitors started publishing a magazine called The Shadow? They could steal the character right out from under them. The thought was too horrible to contemplate. There was no time to waste. Street and Smith decided that as quickly as possible they were going to be the first to create a pulp magazine titled The Shadow. About this time, former magician, journalist, and pulp editor Walter Gibson contacted Street and Smith editor Frank Blackwell in hopes of getting some work. Gibson ended up adopting The Shadow.
Like the wallpaper sticks to the wall, and like the seashore clings to the sea, like you'll never get rid of your shadow, you'll never get rid of me.
I've been a newspaper writer. I've written many articles on mysteries, ancient and modern, psychic subjects, and so forth. I worked for Houdini. I was writing books for him when he died. So when this came along, I had done some fiction, and mostly of the type that was supposed to be true, the confession type of stuff. I was an editor up at McFadden's. I edited True Strange Stories. That was why Blackwell wanted me to write The Shadow, because he knew that I'd edited a weird magazine and that I was also a newspaper writer and could write fast, and he says, go ahead and write something of this thing.
Walter Brown Gibson was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, here in his family home on September 12, 1897. His father owned a successful gas supply company. Gibson served in the Army during World War I. And after the war, he spent years turning out thousands of crossword puzzles and truckloads of articles on magic tricks, fake spirit mediums, and crooked carnival games. Walter Gibson had been married twice when he met his third wife, Pearl, to whom he was married for 36 years. They were a magical couple, literally. Like Walter, she was born in Pennsylvania, and she was also a professional magician and an author. Pearl liked the name Perlitska so much that she went by the name Litska. Here she is, practicing a card trick with Walter and their beloved pet rooster, China Boy. And here's Gibson with his son Robert and grandson Robert Jr. Gibson was the biographer and ghostwriter for well-known magician Howard Thurston, and also for Chicago native Harry Blackstone, the world's master magician. And also for the man who nothing on earth could hold, the world's greatest escape artist, the legendary Harry Houdini. Walter Gibson passed away in 1985. During his lifetime, the wildly productive author wrote more than 100 books on magic, prestidigitation, magicians, poker, card tricks and games, knots, and psychic sciences of all kinds. According to Gibson, every magic trick consists of two components: the effect, what the trick looks like to the audience, and the method, the means used to do the trick. The magician uses the effect to distract the audience from the method. This is called misdirection. There are two special rules in magic. Be careful not to tell the audience exactly what you intend to do, and never repeat a trick. In what was perhaps the greatest effect of his career, Walter Gibson fused the principles of magic with the skills of a newspaperman to write an incredible 282 shadow novels for Street and Smith. But astonishingly, not one of these stories' covers carried the magician-journalist's own byline. Even though The Shadow and Gibson both attended the same magician's convention in an issue of the Pulp. Street and Smith didn't want any superstar writers demanding higher wages, so they forced many of their authors to write under assumed names that could easily be assumed by another writer at management's whim. At least Gibson got to make up his own pen name. He invented the alias Maxwell Grant by combining the names of two magician friends Maxwell Holden, and U.P. Grant. Gibson's autograph intertwines his own name with the famous pen name he created in 1930, Maxwell Grant.
"No, is it really you?" said the learned man. "Well, this is most remarkable. I never supposed it possible that a man's shadow could become a human being. Tell me everything that you saw." "Everything," said the shadow, "for I saw and know everything."
Gibson didn't invent the name The Shadow. In fact, other shadows had been caught in the spotlight long before the Street and Smith production took to the stage. Half a decade before The Shadow, French cabaret singer and comedian Aristide Bruant was famous for wearing a black cape and long red scarf every evening at his nightclub, Le Mirliton. In 1885, a series of posters by Toulouse-Lautrec immortalized Bruant in his familiar black and scarlet uniform. The first masked Avenger to have a secret identity was also French, the Scarlet Pimpernel, created by Baroness Orczy. The Scarlet Pimpernel was the head of a secret society that rescued French citizens during the Reign of Terror. The Shadow was also influenced by Arsène Lupin, a gentleman thief specializing in intricate schemes in impenetrable disguises. The character, created by Maurice Leblanc, was one of Walter Gibson's favorites. Next came All-American Nick Carter, a wealthy private detective and expert makeup artist who was known for carrying a gun in each hand. Carter and his aides battled criminal masterminds starting in 1886. Then there was Master Detective Sherlock Holmes, the hawk-nosed sleuth created by Scottish author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in 1887. Did original Holmes illustrator Sidney Paget use his brother Walter Paget, seen here, as a model for his Holmes illustrations, such as this one? Elementary, my dear viewer. There's not a shadow of a doubt. Jimmy Dale, alias the Gray Seal, was created by Frank Packard in 1914. Dale was a wealthy playboy by day, but at night he put on a mask and became the Gray Seal. Then, in 1919, came Johnson Macaulay's Zorro, the swashbuckling masked Latino swordsman in black, who was first introduced in All Story Weekly's The Curse of Capistrano. The name Zorro means fox in Spanish. In 1922, Street and Smith's Western Story magazine ran a serialized novel called The Shadow of Silver Tip, about an unknown outlaw whom residents of Silver Tip and surrounding territories have named The Shadow. In 1925, The Phantom of the Opera, played by Lon Chaney Sr., transported moviegoers to a mysterious secret sanctum and shocked them senseless when the black-cloaked, masked phantom's horribly disfigured face was finally revealed. In 1927, Bela Lugosi debuted on Broadway in the role that made him famous.
I am Dracula.
Walter Gibson once said his conception of the Shadow was strongly influenced by Bram Stoker's Dracula, a frightening creature of the night with a black cloak and dark, hypnotic powers. In 1929, the Saturday Evening Post ran a series of short stories by famed jazz-age writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, featuring a character in a play who was, as Fitzgerald wrote, a gentleman burglar called The Shadow, only a turns out in the end that he's really a young man about town doing it on a bet. Also in 1929, Street and Smith's fame and fortune pulp featured a mysterious hooded specter haunting Manhattan's financial district with his mocking laughter. His name was Compton Moore, but he was known as the Shadow of Wall Street. Finally, in 1930, the radio Shadow began broadcasting, leading to the creation of the Shadow pulp and the hiring of Walter Gibson to write it. This, then, was Gibson's daunting mission. Take a dark, mysterious shadow with a sinister voice, weird, haunting laugh, and narrator's omniscient knowledge of the story he is telling, and make it live. The sinister voice, weird laugh, and uncanny knowledge of other people's affairs were all wonderful. But Walter Gibson was quite a remarkable man himself, and the shadow he cast was to be far more than just an expert busybody with a peculiar sense of humor. Gibson saw the shadow as the ultimate magician, detective, crime buster, similar to others who had preceded him, but with a difference that made him utterly unique. Remember Gibson's rule about never repeating the same trick twice? He followed that rule in creating the shadow, for the shadow was to be a hero like no other, because his true ancestors weren't heroes, they were villains. Gibson had long hated the way fictional villains get away with all sorts of wild stuff, but heroes usually behave like dullards, until just at the end of the story, when they suddenly find the brains and personality to bring everything to a lovely conclusion. Like many people, Gibson found villains far more interesting than heroes, and wished heroes had a bit of the villain's appeal.
You know something? I could like you if it weren't for your sense of justice and fair play. Why don't you rotten up like me?
Oh, I could never do that.
But Gibson could. He decided to dress his hero in villain's clothing. Gibson's shadow would be a sinister cloaked figure who materialized from out of the night, not to tie fair maidens to railroad tracks, but to untie them, destroy criminals, and generally strike terror into the hearts of evildoers. In an era of rampant lawlessness and imminent war, the Shadow's main mission would be to stamp out organized crime and smash spy rings, but he would occasionally take the time to find a missing heir, oust a dictator from a mythical republic, uncover a buried treasure, or banish a contrived ghost from a phony haunted house. For in the Shadow's well-ordered, completely rational world, there was no such thing as a real haunted house. What did the Shadow actually look like? Before the first issue of the pulp magazine was published, Street and Smith held a big contest offering $1,000 in prizes to the readers who best assembled a series of clues and solved the mystery of the Shadow's appearance. Everyone who entered was sent this autographed postcard. Gibson's working title for his first Shadow story was Murder in the Next Room. When he submitted the first 6 chapters in January 1931, to his surprise, he discovered that with no time or budget to commission a new cover painting, Street and Smith were cannibalizing an old painting that had previously been used on an issue of Thrill Book. It showed a Chinese man cowering in fear of a glowing cross. The cross was deleted. The background was cut out to create a silhouette. The only problem was that there were no Chinese men in Gibson's story. He quickly relocated the scene to Manhattan's Chinatown, completed the remaining chapters, and the finished pulp was rushed to America's crowded newsstands. Don't miss our next thrilling chapter, The Living Shadow.